It is my pleasure to introduce to you Leslie Bechtel Van Orman. Leslie is a teacher of students for visual impairments, an orientation and mobility specialist. She is the program manager for the Wyoming Department of Education, Vision Outreach Services, and the Wyoming Deafblind Grant Administrator. Please join me in welcoming Leslie Bechtel Van Orman.
Thank you all for being here and being here to share a really critical topic. I'm going to share my screen with you all. All right. So the reason we wanted to talk about IDEA eligibility for vision impairment is because over the past 5 years, there have been a couple guidance letters that have come out of the U.S. Department of Education Office of Special Education Programs that are changing how we're going to look at eligibility for children with vision impairment. And this change is already, you'll see, sort of happened. So it's something that we need to do real time as the department is moving forward with also changing Chapter 7 officially to align with this guidance from the Office of Special Education Programs. So, oops, sorry about that. So this is the current Wyoming vision impairment definition, and I just wanted to share it with you so you know where we're coming from as we start to talk about what the U.S. Department of Education is providing in terms of guidance. So we have to have currently in Chapter 7, which is the Wyoming rules for special education, we have to have a documentation of a loss of vision, and that loss of vision has to adversely affect the child's educational performance and require the use of specialized tests, techniques, materials, or assistive technology devices. And I guess I would say first, that really just aligns pretty much with the definition of the IDEA definition of vision impairment. But then Wyoming, as other states have layered on some additional qualifications. You have to have an acuity of 20/50 or less in your better eye with the best possible correction, or a field loss of 20 degrees, or a progressive loss of vision, which may in the future affect the child's ability to learn, or a visual acuity that can't be measured, but the child has a functional loss of vision as determined by a functional vision evaluation. And a functional vision evaluation is an assessment that's done by a teacher for students with visual impairments. So in 2014, the Office of Special Education Programs released a letter, and the people across the country are always writing letters to the Office of Special Education Programs and asking them to clarify things about the law, to clarify things about interpretations and case law. And so when they choose to respond, they write a letter back to the person, and all of those letters are addressed to the individual, and they're referred to as things like this one, the letter to Cutler. So they're not legally binding, but they are considered, like law is, but they are considered guidance and should be taken into the equation as we interpret the rules of the IDEA. And so what this lawyer from Maryland wanted to know is, why is it that some states have eligibility requirements that eliminate or exclude children that have some vision conditions? And those vision conditions are actually conditions that it can impact their ability to read and write. And she specifically noted that convergence insufficiency is one of these conditions. So Convergence insufficiency is how we have to move our eyes when we are looking at something close. Naturally, right when I started to present, then my throat starts to get dry. But anyway, so we humans are really built for far distance vision. We're not built to look at things that are close up. I'm sorry about this. So when we look at things when we look at things far away, our eyes take what they're seeing in the right eye and what they're seeing in the left eye, which are pretty much to the same thing. And they pull those together and they meld them into this amazing three-dimensional visual representation of what's in front of us now in our head. When we pull things closer, our eyes have to move inward in a sort of a strenuous way to be able to get two identical images up close that are going to form that same kind of three-dimensional binocular picture in our head. And for some students, that can be extremely cumbersome and to be able to do. So this is that's the condition she's referencing. So OSEP goes on to write out in this letter, which is the response, a public response to Cutler, the actual IDEA definition. And the first part you're going to see is just exactly what we do every day for kids with disabilities. We have to identify that for a child to be eligible, that they have a disability and that it is, that they need specialized instruction. So at the bottom, then it outlines the specific language in IDEA around visual impairment, which says, a visual impairment, including blindness, means an impairment in vision that even with correction adversely affects a child's educational performance. And they note that this term includes both partial sight and blindness. So OSEP also noted that we can establish standards for eligibility, but those standards can never narrow the definition that OSEP that the IDEA has in its definitions. So they say there are some eligibility categories that have ambiguous modifiers, they say. So there are two examples that they give that are under the second bullet are orthopedic impairment, which uses the word severe, and intellectual disability, which uses the word significant. When you have a word like significant or a word like severe, then the states have the leeway to go in and define that more specifically within their state. But if you look back at the vision impairment definition, there isn't an ambiguous modifier in there. It just simply says that visual impairments is a condition that it has to be a condition, or the condition of vision impairment has to exist, and that it has to adversely affect the child. They go on to say the state eligibility guidelines and definition for vision impairment and blindness can't exclude a child with convergence insufficiency or really any other vision condition from meeting the definition in the IDEA for visual impairment and blindness if that condition adversely affects the child's educational performance. The letter to Cutler also gives some guidance about what comprehensive evaluations for students with visual impairments need to look like. They need to include a data-based assessment of learning media. That's one of the special factors in the IEPs. So that's something that has to happen for all kids with vision impairment. Also a functional vision assessment. And those assessments really need to show the extent and impact of the child's visual impairment. And OSEP lists a lot of different areas in reading, writing, math, computer use of other assistive technology, access to and progress in the general education curriculum. So sort of a powerful letter came out, and it largely flew under the radar of every state in the United States. However, OSEP continued to hear complaints and concerns from families and from lawyers about the implementation and follow-up of this letter. So in 2017, they issued a memo to state special education directors, and what was clarified in the memo was that really the eligibility criteria for almost every state in the United States was non-compliant with the definition in the IDEA. Their memo sort of like reiterates everything they said in the letter to Cutler, and it goes on to talk about that two-step process of having a disability and then adding these additional requirements like acuity or field is a practice that's inconsistent with the IDEA. They walk through the fact that prior to eligibility determination, we do a comprehensive evaluation that has to determine the existence of the disability and the nature and extent of the student's educational needs. They clarify that that might include information from an eye doctor or from a physician, but it doesn't have to. And that's something that's very different than what we've done, where we've really needed that documentation to take that or to get through that second level of the our eligibility definition around acuity or field. They also clarify that no single measure can be used to determine if a child is a child with a disability, because what happens then is that you don't get enough information to really determine what the appropriate educational needs of what the educational needs of the child are. So they want, so evaluation information should be considered, not just to determine if the kid has a visual impairment that makes them eligible, but to determine how that condition adversely affects their educational performance. So what does this mean for us? And that is that visual impairment has to be considered outside of the parameters of that we've applied in the past and that are currently in our state rule. So we need to look at all vision conditions, whether they adversely affect the educational performance of each individual child. However, there's been a real feeling that this was going to open some floodgates, that we were going to have this massive number of kids come in. But I would say it doesn't change that two-prong eligibility requirement for IDEA that still applies. That not only do kids have to have a disabling condition, but they also need to have specialized instruction. So I'm going to walk, because this sort of, like the letter to Cutler really focuses on, or she calls out convergence insufficiency, so which is an eye mobility issue or motility issue. But this will also affect a wide variety of vision conditions. So certainly now thinking just in the basic definitions we've used in the past, it could mean a child whose visual acuity doesn't hit the 20/50 standard, but they have a vision condition. And it may mean a child whose visual field is bigger than 20 degrees. They have a vision condition. What we have to assess now is their need, how that condition adversely affects their education. Because there's going to be a lot, because the vision system, there are going to be a lot of other vision conditions that of students that we may need to consider during child find. I want to provide you with a little information on the vision system, because our scope of understanding is going to be critical in us making sure we don't miss any kids who may need specialized instruction. So when we think of vision conditions, most people just think of the eyeball, and that's really not the case. The eyeball is actually made up of 3 separate chambers. That first section right from the cornea, and I know there are like teachers for students with visual impairments on this call right now going like, that is a little bit of poor contrast there, Leslie. But anyway, between the cornea and the iris, which is the colored part of our eye, there's a second chamber that goes from the iris back to the lens, which is sort of the gray spherical thing you can see in the middle of the eye. The lens is one of the coolest things. It's a clear, almost M&M shaped and sized object that is suspended right behind your iris. There's also a chamber that goes from the back of that lens and fills that whole big globular area in the back, and it's all filled with like clear jello is what it looks like, vitreous. And then in the very back of the eye, you can see where the optic nerve drops out on the bottom right corner of the eye. Another piece of this visual that is a little super hard to see is just above the optic nerve in the retina, there's a little divot. It's just directly behind the lens. And that's called the macula. And it's the place where there's this massive concentration of color and detail receptors. That's where all of the most critical vision process, or the most sharp visual information is processed from. So there are also 3 layers made up. The eyeball's also made up of 3 layers. That's one layer that is labeled sclera. That's the white of your eyeball. It's structural. It's a tough little surface. And then inside it, the choroid is vascularization. It provides the blood flow that keeps the eye healthy. And then the inner layer is the retina, and that's a neural layer. So light enters through that cornea, and the shape of the cornea focuses the light through the pupil in our iris. And then the lens changes, or the iris changes shape in order to modify the intensity of the light that is coming into the eye. And then the light goes through the lens and is further focused. It moves through that cavity of clear jello, the vitreous, and it hits ideally right in that very area on the back of the eye that processes the most details and color vision. And when that light hits the retina, it's changed into neural impulses, which move down the optic nerve and into the brain. So when you think about how vision works, it sort of freaks you out, because you're thinking about because any issue with the health of any one of those chambers or any layer of that eye, or the ability to focus that image on that exact spot on the retina, will result in a vision condition for a person. And then in addition to taking in light and focusing it to hit the retina, the eye has really complex musculature that ensures that our eyes move in tandem and that they are directed and focusing on the same thing. There are a muscle on each side of the eye that turn your eyes right to left. There are muscles on the top and bottom that allow you to look up and down. And then there are muscles that wrap around each side of the eyeball, and they allow you to roll your eyes at your teachers and your parents when you're a teenager. So though that muscle structure allows us to track a line of print, it allows us to follow the motion of a ball that's moving. It allows us to converge our eyes when we're reading, when we're looking at something up close. So any misalignment of the eyes, lack of ocular mobility, any of those issues can make it really difficult for our students to get a clear binocular image into their eyeball so that it can start to move through that whole visual system that we talked about in the eye. And if there's any issues with the or some issues with the mobility, with the musculature, can also make it very difficult for some students to track visually and to scan. So both things that are pretty critical when we're talking about educational and academic skills. So once we get that image into the eye, the neural impulses travel down the optic nerves and into through 57 neural centers that process visual information in our brain. So if there's any damage to the optic nerves, the information may not even get into the brain, or the information that gets into the brain may be incomplete or distorted in some way. And then when the visual information gets into the brain, it travels to the occipital lobe, which is the very back of our brain, which is where the primary processing area for vision is located. And then it goes through both the dorsal and ventral streams of our brain. That ventral stream, which is the lower the lower pathway that our vision processing takes, tells us what we see. That's the what stream. And that allows us to recognize faces. It allows us to interpret facial expressions, to identify and recognize locations, to recognize the familiar routes that we take as we travel during the day. It also allows us to recognize symbols and words. And the dorsal stream, which is the upper stream, is the where of our vision system. So that allows us to process more than one thing at a time. And I would just have you look up across the room that you're sitting in and think about how visually complex that all of the stimuli and how many different visual things you're looking at once. And it's that dorsal stream that allows us to see more than one thing at a time. And damage to that dorsal stream makes some of our students not able to see any more than one thing at a time. The dorsal stream also controls all of our visual guidance of our body, primarily visually guided reach, but also larger motor control, anything where you're coordinating the movement of your body and vision. It also allows us to maintain visual attention. So any small lesion that occurs in that brain, in those visual pathways, can result in a really discrete visual condition for a child. So when that happens, we can have a student who has no other disability, but is struggling and may have a vision condition. Then we think about our kids who have really significant neurological damage throughout multiple parts of their brain. And you can just imagine the myriad of vision conditions that are caused by that kind of damage. I'd also say it's hard for me to imagine a student who has other neurological damage like cerebral palsy or traumatic brain injury that isn't experiencing some sort of cerebral damage-based visual impairment. So when you think about our visual system, you can't think about the eyeball anymore. You have to think about like a high-tech camera and then a computer with optical character recognition and massive processing ability. And that's the visual system. So any issue with that camera or the cord that connects it to the computer or the computer is going to result in challenges in the operation or the total failure of that system. Also, the scope for each of these vision impairments type of vision impairments we're going to talk about just briefly, there's a scope of visual impairment from mild to severe. But even a mild visual impairment can result in significant educational challenges for students. And this is compounded when we think about the fact that many of our students are not identified early on as having a visual impairment. So all of the time that they would have been getting incidental exposure to print, to numbers, to facial expressions, to the shape of our mouths when we talk, all of that access has been limited until the time that we assess those students and determine how to give them access. So they start, many of our students start behind their peers because of a simple lack of visual access to their environment. This is also the case for kids whose vision can be corrected with a simple pair of glasses, and who have had have some level of limited exposure to their environments and that emergent learning time. And that's a big push for the reason that screening is so critical in our early childhood, preschool, and even school districts. So when you see medical or educational information on vision, it's going to fall into one of 4 categories, and our students are going to have one or some combination of all of these visual challenges. And this can be, so acuity is pretty much overall clarity of your vision. That can be everything you see can be unclear, or there is the potential that it's just what you see up close or just what you see far away that is unclear. And astigmatism is a distortion in your vision. Many of us may have those that we don't even recognize, but some people's astigmatism can be super intense. And the last area here really isn't an acuity issue, but it's something that we're learning more about in our field all the time, and it's contrast sensitivity. A student with contrast sensitivity issues might be able to look at the bulleted words on this slide and read them just fine. But if I changed the color of those words to be a light gray, even though the print size had not changed at all, they might not be able to detect the existence of those words any longer. So that's not truly acuity, but I had to put it somewhere. So visual field, we have over 180 degrees of visual field. So, if you hold your arms way out to the sides and you can wiggle your fingertips, and you can see that your visual field goes, further behind you than your ears if you have a full field. The students that we have can have a peripheral loss, which can be just a little bit of visual field loss, or it can be like looking through the tube of a paper towel tube. Other students have a central field loss, much more significant. Not only is there a loss of vision right in the center of where they're looking, but if you remember from the eyeball diagram, that's where the absolute sharpest, clearest color vision is. The peripheral cells that those students have aren't built to read, and they need a lot of support and a lot of technology to be able to utilize those cells functionally for reading and other activities. Hemanopsia is the loss of the right side of vision from both eyes, or the left side of vision from both eyes. Lots of our students with who have cerebral visual impairment or neurological issues have a lower field loss. And then scotomas are just blind spots. And some of our kids have random blind spots. It's their view is like looking through a piece of Swiss cheese. And then now we need to be considering, especially based on the guidance from the letter to Cutler and from the OSEP memo, at ocular motor issues. And that can be the alignment of the eyes, the ability to track, challenges moving the eyes in different ways, and then that accommodation ability that we see in convergence insufficiency. So when you're looking, when we're thinking about eye alignment, when a person's eyes are misaligned, they're getting two different images sent to their brain. And the brain is putting those together. And when they do that, they're going to get something that looks like double vision. And what our brains typically do, especially when our children are younger and their eyes are not aligned, is that it just starts ignoring the image from one of the eyes. It's like, I'm not going to deal with this. I'm just going to pay attention to the right eye or the left eye. Now the brain is not using any of the neurology behind that non-dominant eye. And they're in this state of plasticity. So pretty soon the brain just uses that territory for other things. And what happens if we don't catch it and correct it is the student ends up losing all functional use, permanently losing the ability to functionally use a perfectly good eye, just because the brain is neglecting it because there's a misalignment in the eyes. So pretty critical. That's why it's critical to find those kids when they're young, and and have treatment to maintain the function of that eye. And then cerebral visual impairment, that's what we just talked about with the ventral and dorsal stream damage. The scope of kids with cerebral visual impairment can be from the point of that child having no recognizable visual function to just a kid who doesn't recognize faces or has trouble going downstairs or cannot copy off the board, just really narrow visual function deficits. The other area you should consider that's called out in the IDEA is students with degenerative conditions. We need to, the IDEA really highlights that we need to proactively address these educational needs, which will arise from a future loss of vision. Loss of vision is a super devastating thing for anyone to deal with. For our students, it's massive. We have tons of kids who do just fine in school because they get along with a decreasing visual condition. But the reality is that condition will continue to decrease. And many of those students are kids who are not, are of our students who came out of school with that kind of vision condition. Many of them have not received any specialized instruction. And I have to tell you, most of them are not employed. Many of them end up dropping out of college or training programs because they don't have the skills to be successful. So don't forget about them either, as if there aren't enough of these of things to think about, but that's a big one too. So in thinking about how we need to address the changes in the VI eligibility and how that will affect our day-to-day operations as we provide kids with FAPE. Initially, first, the biggest thing is we need to ensure that these kids are considered in our child find activities. And then I think we need to be clearly understand what a comprehensive evaluation is going to look like. And many of these pieces are already in the comprehensive evaluations that we're doing for all kids with vision impairments. The functional vision evaluation, the learning media assessment, the assessment of orientation and mobility skills, how kids safely travel and independently travel in familiar and unfamiliar environments. The expanded core curriculum is a whole group of areas that teachers for students with visual impairments consider. It's really areas of learning that kids may miss because they can't observe clearly or at all and learn incidentally. So it's things like adaptive daily living skills, recreation and leisure skills, self-advocacy, career readiness skills. And we also have optometric and ophthalmologic information, but more and more we're also going to be needing to attain information around visual perception and ocular motor skills. I'd also just bring to your attention, because vision impairment creates a lack of access, having the functional vision evaluation and the learning media assessment in place early in the evaluative process is critical, because if you don't know what accommodations a student needs, you can't ensure the validity of the other measures that you're going to use to figure out what the student's needs are. So just a heads up there. I think we're also going to see some changes just in how we see the needs we see for students who have vision impairments. You know, this sort of, the first bullet sort of reiterates what I was just saying, that because vision conditions can impact incidental learning, we need to look at not just those academic needs, but the educational needs, things like self-advocacy, daily living skills, understanding of the careers that are out there for us or for our students. We need to make sure we're ensuring that students have skills to access educational materials and environmental information. And a lot of these conditions that we're going to be looking at that we may not have looked at before, the access piece is a big chunk of it. And some kids may be able to access things on for a limited time, but the amount of vision, eye strain, and visual fatigue that they experience makes it impossible to do so in a sustained manner. And all of our students need an understanding of their vision condition and the accommodations they need for success. One of the biggest challenges I think we face in our field as orientation and mobility specialists and teachers for the visually impaired is helping all of you and your educational teams understand that we may know that the kid sees very differently, but however that kid sees is normal to that child. So it's really important for kids to understand that they don't see like everybody else, and that they do need to advocate for different accommodations, or they're not going to have access to information in their educational programming, but through their whole life too. The other piece that I think is going to change a little bit is our services. We do need to remember that not all of our students who have a vision condition will need specialized instruction. I mean, the best thing we can do, as we work with all students, but with students with vision impairments, is get them to the point that they don't need specialized instruction before they leave anymore, that they just need some accommodations. And some of the kids we're going to see as we do assessments and we follow through on our child find responsibilities are going to be kids who do have a vision condition but don't need specialized instruction. Also, because of the broad range of vision conditions, students are going to have to and can have a variety of service providers. So in order to address the needs of some of these students, we may not just need a teacher of students with visual impairments or a certified orientation and mobility specialist. We may need the support and service of an OT or counselors or an assistive technology professional. So being creative about after we've identified their needs, really figuring out who should be providing those services and who's best equipped to do so. And then, what are the impacts of vision, of the vision eligibility changes overall? And I do think we're going to see more kids naturally who are identified as having a visual impairment. But I'm sort of excited about that because many of our special education directors in the state and teachers in our state have called, I've been in many of your classrooms and schools because you have a student and your team just has a gut instinct that there might be something visual about the behavior you're seeing or the challenges the child is facing. So I'm excited that there are students who have struggled in the past and haven't been able to qualify for services through an IEP, who may now be able to receive the specialized instruction that they need. I think one of the biggest fears is that we're going to see lots of requests for vision therapy. Their vision therapy there's controversy around it. I think a lot of that has been that there hasn't been a good research base for some of the practices, but those are developing, and it is thought of as a very valid treatment by the optometric profession. So I do think it is expensive, it is time intensive, and I think some of our families reach out to the school hoping that that will be something that the school can fund, or that the school could provide through one of their service providers. I think that there are going to be definitely cases where some of our educational teams may determine that it's needed for a student in order for a student to benefit from their specialized instruction, that they do need vision therapy as a related service. But I don't think that's going to open floodgates either, because we still have to fall within the rules of the IDEA, which say that a related service exists to support a child in benefiting from their specialized instruction. So that connection and link has to be there. And we're going to be also not circumventing our responsibility to pull the brain trust of our IEP teams together to really determine what the best things are for kids. And that may or may not be vision therapy. I also see that that in our profession as teachers for students with vision impairments, is that there's going to be an increased need for our skills in assessment, because these are areas these are kids that we haven't used our knowledge and skills to assess in the past. So our team is going to be working on some ways to support teachers for students with vision impairments in this area. And we're going to also need increased collaboration between the medical profession, optometrists, occupational therapists, teachers of students with vision impairments, O&M specialists in the evaluation and the service provision. So any questions?
Leslie, this is Susie in Laramie, and I do have a question. When filling out, is the eligibility criteria checklist going to change to reflect these new laws, or do we need to be filling that out in a different way?
It will change once we go through the rulemaking process for Chapter 7, which is sort of has already started, but it's a cumbersome and long process of attaining information. So the advice that we've been giving to educational agencies is to utilize some sort of attachment or to document the eligibility of children who fall into this category, where they have a vision condition, but they would be eliminated because of that second layer that doesn't align with what we now know the IDEA says.
Okay, so we could check yes for the first, after evaluation, check no for the second section, and have supporting documentation.
Yeah, or you could leave the second section, note that that in the second section somehow that you're that the student is eligible based on the guidance from OSEP, and then document clearly, just document what the conditions are, and then your evaluation will stand for or will assist you in getting the needs areas identified.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. This is Sarah in Saratoga. Can you hear me?
Yep.
So could you give like a few examples of places where you may need to step in as a TVI to do the assessment, but then the results would be that you aren't doing specialized instruction afterwards? Are you talking about like a 504, or you're just sort of, could you just maybe elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. That's a great question, Sarah. So I think there are potential areas where a school would have their TVI or contract with the TVI to come in and do an assessment. And then based on the needs, I would imagine that there will, there may be other areas, you may have special education teacher doing part of the assessment. There may be information from occupational therapy that you're pulling in, or assistive technology professionals. But I think sometimes when the team looks at that whole, all of those areas, they may look and see that there are needs for accommodations, maybe even a need for a related service, but no specialized instruction need. So maybe the student has some visual motor issues that the OT needs to address. But there's no special education. There's nothing that the teacher for the students with visual impairments needs to do. There's nothing related to special education. So I think there are those kids that will fall into the world of getting supported, their needs supported through a 504 plan. But I also do think there are certainly students out there who have convergence insufficiency, for instance, that's so significant that they cannot see anything, that they cannot get both eyes to when they get both eyes to focus on anything near, everything is just blurry. The kids I've observed that have that significant of a condition, I've seen tears running down, eyes watering, and tears running down their face as they're trying to focus on a math problem. So I think, those students may very well, the team may look at their needs and say, we have to get this kid some sort of non-visual access or supports for the curriculum to get access to their curriculum. And our team feels like they need to learn a specific assistive technology in order to do this. And the team might determine at that time that the best person to provide that kind of specialized instruction might be the special education teacher within classroom instruction, or an assistive technology professional in conjunction, consulting with the teacher and providing support to attain skills in the technology. So I think there may be situations where the team determines that that there's a mix of who may provide the service.
Any other questions?
I could ask another one. This
Okay.
is Sarah again. Sorry. So are you saying, Leslie, to go back a few slides, that you're working on like a standardized functional vision evaluation form, like a form that you would maybe say, this is what we put out as the Wyoming outreach, as the recommendation that this is how our functional vision evaluations look from here on out?
No, I think what we're talking about is what we're hoping to do is pull together some expertise and provide some training to teachers for students with vision impairments about tools and protocols that may help puzzle through the questions to answer all the questions about need for this group of students. And what we've been talking about currently is probably including occupational therapists in that discussion to really look at, how their piece around visual perception and our piece around functional vision can sort of how we dovetail together to make sure we're identifying all the needs for these students, and really pulling in. Some states moved forward really quickly with these changes, and so we're hoping to find some expertise to make sure that that we have all the pieces in place and are ready to assess these kids. And I would also add, I guess, that we've had these kids sneak up on some of our school districts already, and we've worked with their teams to puzzle through the challenges and figure this out. So if you get into this situation, we are happy to work with you as we go through as you walk through this process, and as we're getting additional supports in place to train staff up and to make sure that we can identify the needs of these students.
Well, Leslie, I want to thank you very much for your presentation today. I appreciate it. We all appreciate it. This is very complex work,